Hi, Thomas from Field Tennis. Do you have a lot of troubles hitting balls into the net? Or perhaps you're hitting over the net and the balls land short? If that's the case, you might be having an incorrect foundation of your ground strokes. You might be thinking that the foundation of a ground stroke, forehand or backhand, is a straight line. It's a horizontal line that goes like this, from which we work our way up and try and get the ball over the net. But in my experience, you will never achieve good consistency with this approach. In reality, the foundation of all ground strokes is an almost vertical shot, a very high shot, from which we work our way down. Here's an example of a stroke that has an incorrect foundation. As you can see, Ellen lines up the racket with the ball so that the racket will move in a horizontal line through the ball. Her strokes do have some power, but they are very inconsistent and many end up in the net. While we've worked on other technical details of the backhand to achieve this change, I want to show you how Ellen changed her swing path and therefore improved her consistency mainly through the drills I'll show you later in this video. Before I go on to drills that will help you improve the lifting part of your strokes and therefore improve your consistency, I need to make sure that you know that hitting low is not a good idea. And the reason is very simple: your margin of error is too small. So if you're imagining a horizontal shot and you're playing like this, then you have a very small margin of error. If you play just a bit too low, if you change the racket's angle by 1 degree, you're going to hit into the net and lose a point. And even if your ball goes over the net very low, it's going to land very short and typically bounce right into the strike zone of your opponent's stroke. So it will be very easy for your opponent to hit that ball. So hitting low is not a good idea. It's way too risky. That's why we need to add some lift to the ball. We need to add some trajectory to the ball. And when we do that, we're going to increase the safety margin, and we will also increase the depth of our shots, and that will make it much more difficult for our opponents to handle those balls. It's also possible that you're playing the balls low because you're afraid to hit a bit higher, because you're afraid to hit the ball long. I have two answers to that. The first one is, why aren't you afraid to hit into the net? Because in both ways you're going to lose a point. And the way I teach juniors is I tell them that hitting long is a much better mistake in the long term than hitting into the net. And that's because if this is your target area somewhere deep in the court, and in practice you hit a bit long, then maybe you're just about 2 meters away from the target area. But if you hit into the net, the ball stops there and you're 10 meters away from your target area, so you missed much more. And so when you're hitting the balls a bit long in practice, you're getting a much better feedback on how to adjust for the next shot. But when you hit into the net, you don't get a good feedback, and you basically have to start a new stroke to see how your shot is going, and only then you can adjust and try and find a good depth of your shots. You might also not be aware of how high and how fast you can play and still keep the ball in. So for example, this shot was in, and sometimes when I ask my students whether they would play a shot like that, whether they would play this high and this fast, they would usually say no, because they say, I think the ball is going long, but then I prove to them, look, your ball went in. And so you must make sure that you really explore what is possible in tennis. How high and how fast can you play and still keep the ball in the court? I shared my views on this in one of my other videos, and you can check the link, you can click the link to that video to see how fast and how high you can play the ball and still make the ball land inside the court. So hopefully I've convinced you that playing low is not a good idea, and now it's time to learn how to play a bit higher. Now if you retain your foundation of the stroke, which is a horizontal line, and you just imagine that eventually you're going to lift the ball a bit higher, that will not work well in my experience, because you will constantly keep hitting the ball low and high, low and high, low and high. And that's because the racket is approaching the ball in a straight line, and it lacks that lifting element, that lifting force that lifts the ball over the net. Even if you try and add that at the last moment, it will not work really well. So in reality, the stroke is actually exactly the opposite. We can actually pretend that we're going to hit the ball up. We have a very similar swing, like we're going to hit the ball up, and then we can level our swing path. We can level our swing path, we can make it less steep, and we will still hit a low ball, a good ball, and yet that ball will have an element of lifting, which will give us that safe clearance above the net and good consistency. And in order to learn that, we need to use the principle of exaggeration. And I will show this drill with a forehand, but it applies to backhand too, because later you will see me playing with the backhand. I'll show you how you can practice if you rally with a partner. But assuming you're alone with a basket of balls, you can practice this like this. So we need to first hit the ball very high. So you don't need to think about technique, you just think about trajectory. So you just imagine that you're going to play a very high loopy ball, and you do that for about 10 repetitions. Now I won't do 10 so that it doesn't take too long, but just that you see the progressions. So initially you just want to play a high ball like 4 to 5 meters above the net and still try to make the ball land in the court. So all of these shots that I played right now, they landed inside the court. And then what I do is I work my way down. So I aim a bit lower, I aim about a meter lower, and I still try to keep the ball in the court. So again, this one landed inside the line, the baseline, it was not too long. And that's how you will also get experience on how deep, how fast, how high you can play and still keep the ball in play. And so you just keep progressing downwards, you work your way down while maintaining this swing that you basically installed. So you installed a certain swing into your racket, into your arm, because initially you had to swing up, and if you had to swing up, you had to swing down before that. So you came under the ball. So initially you came under the ball like this, and now you're just doing a bit less of it. So you don't have to think about it, because the angles of your swing path, the change in angle is very small. We can't consciously tell someone, okay, now swing by 2 degrees less. It has to be a subconscious correction, and your brain will figure that out if you give it an exact task, and the exact task is the height. So you're aiming at a certain height like this, and then you just keep aiming lower and lower and lower, and if you repeat this drill, you're going to maintain the lifting motion, the lifting element of your stroke, and that will give you that safe net clearance and good consistency even when you play a lower ball. So for example, even if I play a ball like this, that's a good ball, it goes with good speed, my stroke still has a certain lifting element which gives me that clearance and some topspin, and I can play fast with consistency. Whereas if I approach the ball like this, I made it this time, but this will not give me consistency because my stroke does not have a lifting element. So I was a bit lucky this time. But when I play a low ball with my normal swing, like this, then I don't feel lucky. I can do this many times and the balls go in, even though I'm playing lower and faster, because my strokes have a lifting element that helps me always hit the ball slightly upward and cross the net. Here's an example of how you can work on the lifting element of your ground strokes. As you can see, I'm starting more slowly and with very good net clearance, but not an excessive amount of topspin. I hit the ball solid and aim high and deep, and while I'm doing that, I have to swing under the ball without even thinking about it, since that's a very intuitive thing to do. That's why I'm not telling you to swing low to high or get under the ball, because all these are simply the consequences of your intention. And in most cases you don't need to be taught that, as it just overwhelms your mind. As I keep playing, I start to work my way down and still maintain a very similar feeling of swinging through the ball. That way I maintain the lifting part of the swing that gives me that extra consistency even when I eventually play faster and lower above the net. Remember Alan's swing path from the beginning of this video? Here's how I work on changing the technique of the stroke through intention first, and not through mechanical corrections. I stand at the net and ask players to hit over me. That gives them a very clear indication of height, and they also look for very safe margins since they don't want to hit me in the head, unless they feel I talk too much. I also make sure that they notice that their shots land in, because most players initially think that hitting at this height will make the ball go long, but they are wrong. So they must learn that there is much more space above the net they can hit into than they originally thought. Once they're fairly consistent at hitting over me and keeping the ball in play, I step away and ask them to work their way down while keeping the same swinging feeling, which is always upwards even when they aim lower. So remember to always think in arcs or trajectories, even when you want to play lower and faster, and don't imagine straight lines, as your technique always reflects your intention. So in summary, even though our normal rally strokes look much more horizontal than vertical, so my normal rally stroke that crosses the net with good clearance is still much more horizontal than vertical. The interesting thing about tennis strokes is that the foundation of strokes is actually a very high, almost vertical shot, from which we work our way down gradually so that we come to the height that we want. When we do that, when we start with high shots, we're going to install or create a certain swing path that goes under the ball and up towards the ball, that gives the ball that lifting force that makes it go up. And even if we later decide to play lower, once we've done this for a while, even if we decide to play lower and faster, and we have correctly trained our strokes that they have this lifting element, then we will be able to play low and fairly fast and still with very high consistency, because we still retain that little lifting element that gives us that safe clearance above the net. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions here on YouTube, in the comments below, or on my website feeltennis.net.